Hello and welcome to this live presentation by El Faro English of our magazine, digital magazine Beacon, covering state cruelty from Bukele to ICE. My name is Roman Gressier and I'm the editor of El Faro English, and I lead a team of journalists based in Guatemala City. And probably many of you have been in contact with El Faro before. You might know that El Faro is the first digital outlet in Latin America. It's founded in 1998, and in recent years, most of the newsroom under the Bukele government has left for exile. And we have an English edition of El Faro in multiple formats. We have basically, you could describe our work as having different speeds. We have quick newsletters and a weekly podcast on Central American news. And then we also have a magazine, which is why we're here today, which is slower and meant to be read with care. So tonight we'll be talking about Beacon, which we published in June, on June 15th. And very briefly, before we get into things, it spans several genres. So we have hard reporting and investigations, we have political interviews, we have long form narrative chronicles, fiction, and poetry. And in terms of geographies, we included stories that are touching on El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, even Louisiana and the Balkans. And this issue was produced by a team of over a dozen journalists, translators, web developers, authors from Central America and the US, which is where I'd like to introduce our co-producer for the evening and facilitator, Megan Mandracchio, a Salvadoran American journalist and intern at the CUNY Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here in Guatemala City with the newsroom. I'm currently in the bilingual journalism program at Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, and I'm currently working on our podcast segments as well as looking for arts and culture stories at the moment.
Yeah, so we'll get more into that a little bit later in the show, and we'll also be speaking with El Faro English staff reporter Juliana Ramazzini, who's from Guatemala and who we've been working with for 2 years now, and whose reporting is included in this issue. And then at the end of the show, we'll also be speaking with Ruben Reyes Jr., a celebrated Salvadoran American author of 2 books of fiction so far. And we included one of his stories from There's a Rio Grande in Heaven, which is set on Mars in this issue. And we'll be back to that in a little bit. But first, I'd like to present our special guest and co-host, Jonathan Blitzer, a staff writer at The New Yorker magazine and author of Everyone Who's Gone Is Here, the United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. And John, you even got to show up at Central American Journalism Forum in Antigua, Guatemala last year, and we haven't let you go since then. How you doing?
It's great to see you guys, and it's a true honor to be here. I mean, as a fan of El Faro in Spanish and now in English, all the work you guys do is just top flight, and so I'm always happy to be hanging with you guys.
Well, we're thrilled that you're here. So before we dig deeper, I just want to invite you to all of our viewers to support El Faro's work. If you appreciate independent journalism that crosses borders, whether they be geographical, sorry, there's a plane over my head, geographic, cultural, linguistic, you can do that at support.elfaro.net. Now, without further ado, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this issue of Beacon. Now, as some of you may know, we launched a digital magazine in a monthly pattern last year. It was launched in May, and it was originally called Central America Monthly. But this year we're doing 2 issues, and we renamed it to Beacon, which, as you may know, is the English translation for Faro, which is, El Faro. So here we are. And the next issue will come out in December. And as you can see, the title of this issue is Land of Bones, Who Will Find El Salvador's Dead? So you can see that El Salvador is front and center in this issue. And it has, we're really focused on investigative and narrative journalism. So you'll find stories about mass graves in El Salvador and 3 men who were buried after dying in prison without their family's knowledge. So there's stories from past and present on impunity and those searching for the disappeared in El Salvador. And that's why we call El Salvador a land of bones. It was a land of bones before Bukele, and it very much still is today. This issue also goes beyond El Salvador. So our managing editor, Oscar Martinez, chronicled ICE in Louisiana, immigrants in hiding, children left behind while their parents were deported. And as the editor of the issue, I think I was attracted to the idea that the US is also a Central American country. in a way. The political lines increasingly blurred, and the population of the region is spread across borders. And I think one of the things that connects the stories between El Salvador and Louisiana is who's on the receiving end of the abuses, right? So I want to kick things off, John, and just ask you, you've been covering Central America for a long time. You also cover U.S. Politics. What's your sense? Is the U.S. paying attention to Central America and to Central Americans?
I mean, it's a good and painful question, because I think, as you're alluding to, the reality has always been that the United States and Central America are so deeply entwined that, to my way of thinking and to yours, it almost doesn't make sense to speak of them as separate places. So much is interconnected. But I think in political terms, there really is, at least on the US side, a pretty kind of concerted effort to act like nothing but what happens in the US matters, where the wider region is concerned. Even though, Central Americans living as immigrants in the United States, their families who've been here their whole lives, have to live out the consequences of that. And we've obviously always seen that. I think now is an exceptionally pitched moment in American politics where there's just such darkness. I actually think in many ways, and you and I should talk about this, I want to hear your thoughts on it. There are so many parallels between the United States and El Salvador right now, just in terms of the general bleakness of the political landscape, and the kind of real surge of authoritarianism. I mean, tell me, is it strange to watch what's happening in the United States from the standpoint of Central America, and specifically as someone who, has reported extensively on Bukele? Because I often find myself, for instance, saying to people, Bukele's state of exception, which I would say by and large, most Americans do not know about, is in many ways a kind of fantasy for someone like Trump. And you say that here in US circles, and there's a little bit this feeling of, okay, get off your high horse, like a country of 6 million people, a model for Donald Trump. But I actually really think in many ways it is this kind of controlled experiment that he strives to have here. But tell me, I mean, what's it like watching the chaos in the US from your vantage point? It must be surreal.
It's interesting. I initially arrived in El Salvador to work with El Faro as a full-time staff reporter on January 4th, 2021. And 2 days later, it was January 6th. And, a bunch of us colleagues, we were watching January 6th unfold on TV. And, I had just left the United States. Yeah. And I think, it's not like, you can't necessarily plot one point in time and say, this is the moment where everything was, where everything came into sync in terms of the US and El Salvador. But I think just more broadly, and historically, politically, socially, like we're really all breathing the same air, and the political processes that happen in Washington are certainly like very closely intertwined with, what's happening in El Salvador. And so, even the changes of US administrations, I think it was, we could feel a notable difference in terms of U.S. policy approach and how El Salvador was reacting to that. So, and I remember being in El Salvador in 2024 for Bukele's inauguration of an unconstitutional second term, and I remember how both Donald Trump's team and his son was there, and others from the MAGA sphere were present at his inauguration, and also Secretary of Homeland Security Mayorkas, so who you know well from your coverage. So I just think that there was a lot of ambiguity about the policy, but now that Trump has returned to office, I do think that there's a very open closeness. It's no longer through influencers. I remember back in 2021, Bukele was on Tucker Carlson's show. Now it's much more. The through lines are much more evident, and they trace directly, to the White House and so I think, I would just say that there's a way that I think perhaps people in the U.S. think that what happens in Washington, ripples down to Central America, but I also think that the inverse is true. We can get more into that, but those are my first thoughts. I wanted to ask you as well, because yesterday you just published a big piece in the New Yorker into Camp East Montana, which is not in Montana, it's in Texas, into really grisly abuses that are happening there. I wanted to know if you could tell us more about that. What are you learning about what's happening in this detention facility in particular, and how that fits into your broader reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I'm spending these days the lion's share of my holistically trying to document and write out, what's happening to immigrant communities across the United States. And I think one kind of common misperception surrounding Trump's sort of general immigration push, at least the one that he campaigned on, was that everyone's kind of used to hearing in some form or another about this campaign of mass deportations. And there are all kinds of, I think, just general confusions about what that means on human terms and in policy terms and so on. But I think in some ways, what it should always have been known as was a mass detention campaign, which is one of the reasons why I actually think it's probably quite relevant to people who care about El Salvador and just the vast expansion of prisons under Bukele in the last couple of years during the state of exception. Because essentially what's happened is, tens of thousands of people have been detained in the United States in detention center, in immigration detention centers across the country. Right now, that figure is around 60,000. A couple of months ago, it was as high as 70,000. That's the highest it's ever been. The Department of Homeland Security has never detained that many people. And unsurprisingly, on a good day, even before the current Trump administration, conditions inside immigration jails are horrific. Again, compared to some of the facilities in El Salvador during the state of exception, I don't know. I mean, that's a real race to the bottom. But the conditions in these detention centers have always been terrible. There's been really bad medical care. There's been abuse by guards. There's been inedible food. Every manner of horror you could imagine, and many you can't imagine, have been a reality for years in immigration detention. But those things have only gotten worse as the general population has grown, as more facilities have cropped up and opened, and as the government feels less and less accountable when instances of abuse and injustice have been brought to light. And so my interest in Camp East Montana in El Paso had to do with the fact that that facility is the largest immigration detention facility used presently under the second Trump administration. It's got a capacity of holding up to 5,000 people. It's never reached that high. In January, which is the highest point the population had ever reached to Camp East Montana, the population was around 3,000 people. This is in one facility. And this facility itself is on a military base. It's not a brick and mortar jail in any kind of conventional sense. It's actually a tent complex. And this was very much the design last summer when this complex was first constructed. The government, the Trump administration, was increasing arrests. It was changing its policies so that it could hold people indefinitely without bond, meaning people were getting stuck in detention. It was getting virtually impossible to get out of detention, even if you didn't have a criminal record, even if you'd lived in the country for decades and so on. And so the administration was scrambling to find places to put all of the people it was trying to arrest. And so one of the early forays that the administration made was into what the government calls soft-sided facilities. It's almost like an Orwellian term to describe basically, tent cities. And so the first people to arrive at the tents at Fort Bliss, the military base where Camp East Montana is based, literally arrived at an active construction site. So for the first 2 months, people who were in these tents were, describing hearing jackhammers through the night, dust coming in through, holes in the tent, not being able to breathe, water not working, basic things not working, phones not being hooked up, people basically being held incommunicado, completely cut off from the outside world. And so the idea of the story was to sort of anatomize, what's happened at this facility. And over the last, year, the stories of what's gone on at this facility have just gotten graver and graver. And there was a period earlier this year, I guess late 2025, early 2026, when in a matter of 40 odd days, there were 3 deaths at Camp East Montana. And one of those deaths, which ICE had described as a suicide, turned out to actually be a homicide. And evidence has been destroyed, and the government has kind of hid the ball and changed its story. And so the idea was to try, through the stories of actual people who'd been held there, to kind of anatomize what staying in this detention center looks like, and by extension, how we should be thinking about this detention crisis nationwide.
Yeah, going back to your initial question about what I see in common in the politics of El Salvador and the U.S., I think, in this issue, we published a story with these, we reconstructed these 3 stories of these people who, died in Salvadoran prison, where it's an opaque system under the state of exception, and they didn't, their families weren't notified of their burials, and there were subsequent things that happened, but this was just like a way of drilling down into some of those, into the opacity in a way, with there was a line in your article about how ICE had, rather than giving information about a detainee, had put on their website, reach out to ICE for contact, or contact ICE for information. Sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah. There is a parallel of opacity there, and yeah, I think that's one of the issues that we were tugging at in this issue. We wanted to, in this issue of Beacon, we wanted to kind of put those things, juxtapose them in a way. So,
and how do you guys? I mean, this is a question I've always had for reporters and writers at El Faro, because you guys are able of doing you guys are capable of doing investigative things that are deeply humbling to me and to other journalists. I don't know how you get some of the stuff you guys get, just the level of detail, the level of specificity. But like, to your point about how opaque things are at, inside Bukele's prison system, I mean, how do you even know? Like, what avenues do you have into the realities of these facilities? Are you guys speaking to people who've been released, to family members? I mean, how do you even begin to try to do an accounting of how many people have died in some of these facilities, or how many people are even being held in some of these facilities? I mean, you can't trust government numbers or government statements.
Yeah, and thank you. Yeah, I think our colleagues at El Faro, who've been covering this story for a long time, they haven't let go of they've been tugging on the thread, and they just haven't let go. So last year, for example, we published a video in one of our magazine issues where it was basically testimonies of people who had emerged from Salvadoran prisons, and they, in their own voices, were telling the stories of torture, of death, of what was really happening on the inside. And there are investigations in course, international investigations, that are also a source of information. So, you draw from all of the available resources, but I think at the end of the day, like, people who have been there understand what happens, and they can tell you about it. So that's. I want to just put a pin in this, because we want to welcome onto the show Juliana Ramazzini, a staff reporter at El Faro English from Guatemala, and who's working here in Guatemala City with me. Welcome, Juliana.
Hi, thank you for having me here. Hi, Jonathan. Hi, Roman. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us. Juliana has been with us for 2 years now. On August 1st will be the 2-year mark. And we've been in Guatemala as a team for 5 years now. We've had constant presence here. And Juliana has really helped us to deepen a lot of our political coverage. And I do want to transition here. We can come back to El Salvador later in the show. But Juliana has done an incredible job covering politics and justice, not only in Guatemala, also very closely following Honduras and Costa Rica and El Salvador, which, who knows how you do all that. And we're very lucky to have you here. So thank you. And we wanted to ask you about this interview that we included in this magazine, in this issue of Beacon. You interviewed Guatemala's defense minister, Henry Sáenz. And what can you tell us about this interview? What drew you to him? I mean, you've interviewed a lot of big names in Guatemalan politics. Why him? Why now?
Okay, so first of all,
can I add one question to that? Question to that? Also,
yeah,
where was the interview? Like, what was the scene like?
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
First of all, it's not that common that defense ministers are giving interviews like all the time. So this is a minister that is really open to speak And I thought like this was a good chance to understand what was happening with all, like, the Guatemala is a close ally to the United States in the region, despite like the ideological difference that a president, like a self-proclaimed social democrat president as Bernardo Arevalo has, and a conservative as Trump. So I feel like this was an opportunity to like try to understand the different agreements that they have signed throughout their administrations, but mostly the military agreements. Because I don't know if you remember that a few months ago, the New York Times and El País just published a report that was saying that they have signed an agreement on undertaking joint air strikes on Guatemalan soil against drug gangs. So that's what I feel like I needed to like try to reach out to him in order to understand what was the deal with this agreements. Where was the interview? It was in his office, the defense, like the place where the minister is sitting, and it was a beautiful, beautiful office. I feel like it's way better than the presidential office, and that caught my attention.
Revealing, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that when we came. I went with Juliana to this interview, and you mentioned that, like, basically right off the bat when we left, that you felt like it was a bigger office.
Yeah, I felt it was a bigger office, and it was beautiful. But it has a lot of like details, and yeah, I thought like probably this was a sign on how powerful was the military a few years, like decades ago. So yeah, that's
Are
where
you saying the Guatemalan military is not powerful today?
not, I'm not saying that, but remember that a few decades ago, the military were in power, like they were like running the government. So yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, John, you have the next question.
I gotta ask. I mean, I read that Times report and that El País report, and it caused shockwaves. And I thought you were really, I thought it was actually kind of elegant how you handled this, because obviously he's not going to come right out and validate any of this. And I feel like you asked him some version of the question of, well, are U.S. armed forces operating in the country? You asked him kind of a few different ways. Like, what was your sense? Did you buy his? Did you buy his answers? Did you feel like he was evading? Was there anything revealing in how he tried to sidestep the question? Just curious what you made of it.
Yeah, well, I feel like it wasn't revealing. It wasn't that revealing in the sense that he was like saying that the only reason that they were here was to cooperate. But what do you mean by cooperate? Like there could be a lot of things like going like into the same como like the same meaning, right?
Right.
So I don't know if it was that revealing, because uh, they say like they wanted three things from the United States. They say that they wanted training, they wanted equipment, and they wanted infrastructure. So that could be a lot of things. Um, so maybe he was trying to avoid like to dig like deeper on what cooperating means. So yeah, that's I try like to get more information, but that's the only thing that we could get.
Yeah.
But you know what was surprising to me, that he was really open to like to speak. Like that's not common. I mean, I don't expect that from a military. So that at least on that side it was surprising.
Yeah. It felt like he had something to say. There was a moment. It was a moment. It was a window of opportunity to get him on the record on a number of issues, right? And one of the through lines in the interview, I think, is this question of, Guatemala and the U.S. are historic allies. They've been allies for decades, but what does Guatemala really want from Trump, and what does Trump really want from Guatemala? And what was your sense?
Okay, so that's a good question. Because we were seeing like they're asking for training, they're asking for equipment, they're asking for infrastructure, but if it's an agreement, what is Guatemala offering to the United States? And so the minister said that they were offering they are building this sort of a dry port, which is like a railroad that is connecting different ports within the country. And this is because the Panama Canal is going through a crisis right now, not only political, they're running out of water right now. And they are offering like to be an alternative to a Panama Canal, but in a dry way, like just building or connecting different ports. So that's something that's of interest to the United States. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's basically what they're offering.
Yeah, fascinating. Can I ask a possibly related question, although something maybe a little bit tangential to that? I was fascinated by what he said about the kind of wider region and this kind of broad acceptance of the need to have, if not a state of exception, then what he called a state of prevention. But in any case, to have kind of the military be more actively involved in, kind of regular policing, kind of security, public safety measures. There was a quote that I jotted down because it really called out to me. He said, all governments are finding it necessary to use the armed forces. He said, public and civilian security forces are not enough. Walk us through what your sense is of what he's referring to there, because that I thought was quite striking. I mean, he's at pains in this interview to make the distinction between how Arevalos government is managing security and how, say, Bukele's government is. But he is also at the same time saying, look, there's a sort of a generalized need to engage the military more in policing for public safety. Tell us about that. What was your sense of that?
Yeah, maybe it's because like the police, it's not a trusted way of getting security in our countries, because I mean in the region, because we have been known for being violent countries, and the civil securities has not done anything to to solve that. But I think that he meant more in the sense of the fight against drug trafficking. That's what he meant by like using the military on that sense. I don't know, like I don't know what he meant with other countries, but I guess that in the case of Guatemala, he was trying to say that that's our huge problem, and that's why they need us, because it's not enough to have the police on the streets. And he also mentioned that they mentions that the military are going on like this. I don't know what where I'm looking for, but they're going with the police to work with the police, because it's not enough. But I think it's on the places where more drug trafficking is happening right now.
Gotcha.
Because the state of prevention that you mentioned, it's not happening throughout in the whole country. It's just on specific places. So I feel that's what he's pointing to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this issue of the state of emergency, which has been scaled down progressively and is now just kind of in a few spaces, reminds me of Honduras. Back in November, December of 2022, they installed their own state of exception, and at the time, I spoke with the security minister, and it was very much like we're not taking the El Salvador route, but they also were. It was also inspired by that model. And I'm wondering if your sense is that the Arevalo government in Guatemala is trying to strike a similar balancing act where they adopt a measure that's very visible to the public to send kind of like a signal, but they try to distance themselves from the criticism that state of exceptions have received in the region.
Well, maybe it's like kind of sending a soft power message, but yeah, I don't know. I think that they need the help from. They are not able to do it with. I mean, this problem, this drug trafficking problem, is not something that is going to be solved just by like getting the military on the streets, you know. But probably if they do this, they are sending a message that they are trying to fight against that. But as you said, balancing the, like, in the sense that they are not trying to get them involved in other things that are not merely security.
Well, this is really interesting. I want to know, where maybe we can close things here for now, Yuli. What stories are you, as I said, you've been covering politics, justice. You just went to a community outside of Guatemala City to write a narrative chronicle of a burial 30 years after the peace accords. What stories are you drawn to today about Guatemala, and what do you want to write about, basically?
As you mentioned, we're turning 30 years of the signing of the peace accords. So I feel there's a lot of things to tell around that topic, because there are a lot of sequels. As you mentioned, that chronicle I just published. It's an example of how the state is not accomplishing what they promised on the peace accords. They were supposed to build a place for the victims to be buried, like, on a dignified space, and they didn't. They were just like pile up on a really dark place with, like, their families weren't able to, like, bring flowers or to, like, you know and they had to do it by themselves, and they spent like 20 years, like, just piled up on that place, and, like, dark, empty place. And yeah, so I feel like that is something that probably nobody's, like, seeing right now, and I would like to, like, work on trying to tell the stories about what's happening after 30 years of the signing of the peace accords.
Well, we know you will. So we're excited to keep reading stories
Yes,
from you.
I always read it.
Yeah, and also don't forget that I'm also covering Honduras and Costa Rica, so you should expect some pieces on those countries also.
Soft plug for our newsletter, right? People can go to
Ye-
elfaro.net/en to read more of Juliana's work. Thanks for coming,
Yeah,
Yuli.
well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me here. Nice to see you too.
Bye.
Good to chat with you.
Bye.
And last, we would like to welcome Ruben Reyes Jr. To join us.
Hey guys, what's up?
Hey, great to see you.
Great to see you both.
So
Where are you right now?
I'm in Queens, New York.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, in my apartment, thankfully.
Good.
Wonderful to have you here. So Ruben is a Salvadoran American journalist from Southern California, right? But now based in Queens. Forbes 30 under 30, mind you, and author of a collection of short stories, which we featured in this issue of Beacon. There's a Rio Grande in Heaven, and the novel Archive of Unknown Universes, both by Mariner Books, HarperCollins. And Rio Grande in particular, I mean, you racked up a bunch of acknowledgement for this book. You were a finalist for the Story Prize, Aspen Words Literary Prize, California Book Award, the Farrow Grumley Award for LGBTQ Fiction. And we picked up on one story, and I reached out to you and I said, I just feel like this is the story that connects with this issue of the magazine, right? The Salvadoran Slice of Mars. Can you tell us, and I understand, just as a last point, this is the first story that you started writing in this collection, or is that not true? You can fact check me on that.
It's true, yeah. In a very, like, long, stories take a long time. So it changed a lot, but yeah, it's the earliest thing that I kind of conceptualized that actually made it into the final book. And basically it's a story about, it starts with a man, and he's detained but we quickly figure out that it's on Mars. There's a detention center that's built on Mars, and from there we kind of see this effort by Central American nations and Mexico to colonize Mars. And the guy's an American, so it's a story about what citizenship says or doesn't say. He feels very much both of the United States and El Salvador, but in the world I've constructed, that doesn't make sense, and it ends him in detention. It was about a lot of things, but definitely inspired by the first Trump administration and the kind of conversations that were happening around detention and immigration enforcement then.
It still felt very current. It was like it could have been written yesterday.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's really, that's always the goal with fiction, right? To write something that feels not too, that always feels timely, but has that kind of universal aspect that makes it last. And it's also just the way we're talking about immigration, it's shifted in some ways, but the core kind of misconceptions, which is really what I was interested in writing about, haven't changed too much. Yeah.
In one of the interesting, there are so many inversions of what a reader might expect going into a story like this. But one of the central inversions, and you're alluding to it now, is the fact of his American identity is a kind of liability to him.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. What does it mean that he's American? What kind of hot water does that get him into? And why looked it that way?
Well, in the world of the story, like being American on Mars is the worst thing that could happen, right? You're not allowed to be there if you're American. And part of it was like, it was just like a funny kind of weird concept. Like, what if that was the case? Like, what would happen if the people being marginalized were American? I think Americans feel so entitled to their safety and to their status and to things that they don't offer to immigrants in this country. So that was the starting point. But it was also a story about the kind of complicity of Central American governments and the Mexican government. I think in 2016, when I first came up with, the first draft of this story, I was thinking a lot about how Mexico was helping enforce the U.S.'s immigration policy at the cost of Salvadoran immigrants and Central American immigrants, Guatemala and Central. Yeah. I think as time has shifted, I'm really thinking a lot more about El Salvador's role and Bukele's role, right? Who was a non-entity to me in 2016, basically. And so, yeah, it's really interesting that the story is the story, but this question of what complicity do Latin American governments have in all of this, I think is the kind of question that is still being asked and being turned over in new ways, that the story kind of hovers around or touches on in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. We want to invite Megan Mandracchio back to join us, our co-producer and intern journalist at El Faro English, because she has a question for you.
Hi, Ruben. I'm really excited to ask you a question. You've written from a decidedly Central American perspective, and I'm wondering, in your personal opinion, how does fiction engage with the realities that people face, and does it feel like there's a thin line?
Yeah, I think there is. I'll speak to what I can say about my fiction, because I think I think the goal when I'm writing is always to write the story that only I could write. So it actually means a lot to hear that it felt very Central American. It's a really important part of my life and identity, and a complicated one, right? As someone born in the States. But I think for me, I'm always thinking about how fiction can get to truth. And I think for a lot of writers, there's the emotional truth part of it, right? There's a family relationship in this story. There's the experience emotionally of the detained protagonist. But it's really a story about politics and about systems and about what governments do to some of the most vulnerable people. And so I think for me, the kind of game with fiction is to make sure that it always feels true, even when it's set, somewhere on Mars, or it feels very unreal in other ways. I think I try to write, weird speculative fiction, that obviously can only do what fiction does, which is kind of these big leaps of imagination, but they do say something about our world and that feel like they're reflecting on the world. I think of it as like looking in like a funhouse mirror, kind of, right? It's not going to be a direct reflection, but it's going to be a cool and interesting kind of refraction.
Yeah, thank you.
I feel like, you know, I'm reading this and whatever, the obvious words are coming to mind sort of genre-wise, like, you know, there are dystopian elements, there are fantasy elements, there are sci-fi elements. I mean, we're not even talking about climate change and all of this, which is obviously a central plot point. And I have to say, like, to know, it's actually, I mean, of course it makes sense now that you say that, you know, this is, I knew this was part of the story collection. So of course it makes sense to me that you would have been kind of cogitating on this going back years. But it's so interesting to know that you first started conceptualizing this in 2016, because, you know, that's 10 years ago. And like in the kind of on the continuum of then to now, I don't know, some of the dystopian elements here don't even seem that far-fetched anymore. Whereas in 2016, they would have. So, I mean, there's also that element too. I'd love to know kind of what it means to you as a writer who's always pushing these boundaries about kind of the real and the imagined, you know, what's fantastical, what's speculative, at a time when our present reality is so surreal, it almost feels all encompassing, even just right here, right now.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's actually so cool. Like, it is kind of amazing when you kind of like accidentally prophetize or like, I don't know, like get things right. I think a lot about like Octavia Butler, right, who had an amazing and respected career in her life, but like Parable of the Sour like really took off in 2020, like when people rediscovered it and were like, oh, she wrote 20 some years ago about what we're living through right this second, right? There was something about, like, I think speculative fiction can do that, especially the most politically engaged. And as a writer, I think it's about taking, you know, I'm trying to write the next book. So I'm like, well, how did I get some things right? The things that I got right, how did I get them right? And I think it's just like kind of taking a bet on the direction that things are going, but also a bet on the direction of what humans tend to do. And sometimes it's a little cynical. Sometimes it's like, you know, has a side of optimism. But, you know, for this story, you know, I was like, if somehow Central America against all odds colonized Mars, I know that they would turn on someone, right? They would turn on themselves. They would turn on people that should be their allies. And so, you know, using that as a starting point to then build the world was like, you know, it felt like a fair bet. You know, that's what's happening now, right? You know, as soon as people get power, they lose all their morals, it feels like. Yeah, hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Oh, 100%, it absolutely does.
I wanted to ask you, you know, this was recognized by the Pharaoh Grumley Award. Did I get the second last name right on that? Let me see. Yeah, Pharaoh Grumley, the Pharaoh Grumley Award for LGBTQ fiction. And basically throughout, there's a Rio Grande in Heaven. There are a lot of queer characters, and there seems to be a dialogue between that part of those aspects of the characters and Central American identity and other things that are going on. I just wanted to know, like, how you approached writing LGBTQ fiction. There's a story called Quiero Perrear, which I had also commented to you that I also really enjoyed. It was kind of like problematic biking chaos. It was very funny. I wanted to know, like, you know, what was going through your head as you were creating this space for Central Americanness and queerness through your fiction.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's something about, and this is going to get real, like ethnic studies, cultural studies, I think, very quickly, but I'll say that there's something about like being Central American and not, you know, the Arturo Arias thing of, you know, invisible even within the Latino kind of, you know, if there's a representation of Latinos in culture or in media, you know, Central Americans are still invisible. And I think there's something about queerness that is kind of similar in that way, and that you grow up not knowing or seeing like true or complete representations of queerness, especially the more marginalized you are, right? queer person of color. And so I think there's like something there about, how those things work together. And then when I was thinking about the characters and the stories, I think, queer people and queerness is such a big part of my life in general that it had to be in the book. And the most important thing for me was to make sure that there were, layers to it, or different kind of representations of queerness, right? So in some stories, it's like kind of a detail about a character, right? There's like a queer couple in this story, but it kind of doesn't, the story works even if it's a straight couple. It's not the source of conflict. In some other stories, it is the source of conflict. And so, yeah, that was another important part of it. And with all my writing, right, like the politics are kind of front and center, I'm not very interested in writing lightly political or unpolitical or apolitical fiction. And I think that's why it's important to just like, bring queerness into it, bring everything. I'm quite a maximalist, I think, when I write. And the game is then to like make it work.
Mm-hmm. Love it. All right. So you've taken a break from publishing. You're now focusing on your own writing projects. But on one hand, you're a writer, and on the other hand, you've helped other writers kind of find their stories. What is the state of Central American fiction today, and what are urgent stories that need to be told?
That's a great question. Yeah, I feel very lucky to be writing when I'm writing. I think I had recently talked about this, and it like clicked for me that the timeline is just so precise for me personally. In that I think growing up, I was like, there's no Central America, like what? I didn't even think, right? Like if someone was writing, it was like white for much of my life. And then in college or late high school, college, a little bit more diversified. But even when it was Latino, it was like Puerto Rican or Mexican, basically. And then I got to college and I started learning that there were Central American writers who had written in Central America, which was huge. And then I learned that there was diasporic writers. But I think of like watershed moments for me, and it was like Javier Zamora's collection in 2017, which John, I think you wrote something about. I remember seeing that.
Yeah.
The poetry collection. Yeah, the first book. And then he's had this like great success with this incredible memoir. But I feel like 2017 feels like this, to me, kind of like transition point, because it felt like Javier's book was one of the first to kind of break out in a traditional kind of system to the point where I could access it, right? Like as the kind of reader I am with the resources I had. Though many, 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 many other people have been writing for years, obviously in the States. And then from there, I think it's been like a lot, like especially in the fiction space. I've been quite a few other Salvadoran writers. So it feels like I'm in a cohort, which then also when I'm like, okay, we're going to Mars, or we're, putting a robot in the story, or right now I'm working on a story with a hologram. Like, I feel like I've been given permission because there's so much, the groundwork has been laid. And so I'm excited about it mostly. I think I don't feel the pressure to write the things that I think were being written in the 90s, which were a little bit more kind of like immigrants are people, and here, they have emotional lives, and here, let me show them to you, right? Types of fiction that I think are really important, that I still love, and that I think are excellent, but that I'm less interested in writing, and I think because people have written them. I can do my weirder thing about the politics of it all, and feel like, there are other books that do different things in regards to moving the conversation on immigration forward.
Well, we're really excited to have this story in the issue. It just felt like it just clicked, and hopefully we can continue exploring ways to incorporate fiction. We also have poetry, so stay with us here, Ruben. Don't go anywhere, because we're going to read the poem in a second here that we included in this issue. But it just, one of the things that I really wanted to focus on editing this issue was just kind of having more dialogue between genres. El Faro is very well known for these like hard-hitting investigative stories, and those are also present in the issue, and that's all fine and good and necessary, and we're going to keep doing it. But also approaching things from a lens of fiction or poetry is just refreshing, and I think adds a different beat to the magazine. Yeah. So we're just really happy to have you in this
thank
issue.
you. It's an honor, and I think I'll say really briefly that I think it's been important to me to read widely across genres, and like journalism is the basis of so much of my work. I write my fictional stories, they're rooted in what's happening in the real world, and if no one's writing those stories, I have nothing to start with. So I just feel honored to be in this dialogue with all of you.
Totally. And thank you. So stay here. We're going to have Megan join us again. We were very lucky to publish a poem by Nicaraguan exiled Yoconda Belli, who's very near and dear to us at El Faro. We've published columns of hers since 2019 when I started as a translator, and we've published multiple poems. Last year we did a poem, and I will let Megan present the poem that we chose to close out this issue.
Yeah, so this Has Pain Citizenship. It's a poem by Gioconda Belli, and it's been translated into English by Alba Hawkins. What's the citizenship of pain? Some criticize those who feel others' pain like their own, who grieve for those who drown, suffer for those bearing the sting of lashes on their backs. They ask why weep for strangers, people who do not share their same history, language, their daily bread. The boy the sea left on shore, dressed in his best travel suit, his little shoes well polished, his shirt, the socks he thought would carry him into the new life, to find instead his mouth filled with sand and salt, seashells whispering in his ears news of his own death. What's the citizenship of pain? Does each human heart display a map that bears only its own geography? No man is an island, wrote the poet John Donne. And he also said, each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know, for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. The world's bells toll, sounding the alarm. Borders and prison cells, cities and schools, town halls and the sea are filled with the images of dead bodies. Desolation envelops the comfort of our lives piercing holes in our daily indifference. One day they will come for us. That day we will regret our denial to feel pain when we see someone sentenced to death. A city reduced to rubble, prisoners beheaded, a woman stoned to death for adultery. Some people ration their tears as if our bodies did not contain in abundance water, such as where people drown, after they abandon the shine of their own land to board the boats for the dispossessed. Each death strips us of life. We use words to trick our hearts. We speak out against violence, even though we are its instigators. Solidarity is a worn-out idea. It slips through the cracks of razor-sharp arguments that cut rather than shield the soul. The bell tolls for us, and we must own others' pains, dare to erase borders, take a stand for compassion.
That Has Pain Citizenship from El Pez Rojo que Nada en el Pecho, which is a collection of poetry by Gioconda Belli. We're very grateful to her for giving us this poem to include in this magazine. And just to close things out, I want to thank everyone for coming again. This is the last live I think we did in like 2021. So we want to be in closer contact. We had done events for subscribers to our newsletters, which we're of course still interested in doing, but we also wanted to have more frequent and broader contact with with our different audiences on different platforms. You'll see that we have an Instagram account now, finally, which we are very regularly feeding new material. And we have a podcast, Central American Minutes, which you can find on major podcast platforms, also on YouTube. And we also have a newsletter. So that's a little bit, and the next issue of Beacon, our next big magazine project, is due in December. So stay tuned for that. And thank you, Ruben, Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Megan. And thank you, John, for coming.
It's great to do this with you. Great to celebrate Beacon.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, take care, everybody.